The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
Top of the day, I'm Joe Doolittle.
And I'm Kate Dudding.
And this is Story by Story.
Celebrating the human spirit.
And we celebrate the human spirit by listening to and telling stories. Mm-hmm. And stories are the oldest form of kind of formal or informal communication. Mm-hmm. It's how the folks taught each other in the caves and on the plains and in Hogan's and things like that.
I'm going plains? We went from...
No, not this kind of plain.
Masons,
plains,
kinda,
as in the steppes of Russia.
Yes,
those
exactly.
We're going to spend the next period of time with you talking about stories, talking with a great storyteller, and we're going to listen to stories, and we're then going to talk about what those stories have to teach us or make us smile or those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. But Kate, I'm feeling a little bit like I haven't been able to keep up with all the storytelling that's going on in the month of January. How about you? What have you been doing with storytelling?
Well, I had an idea that the National Storytelling Network, which is the organization that supports storytellers, I consider it their professional organization, like the AMA for doctors.
Yeah.
I thought it would be good if they established a relationship with the moth. Which started out in New York City but has spread to many cities across the country and in other countries, specializing in personal stories. So I talked to the artistic director of the Moth on the phone with the blessing of the board of the National Storytelling Network. And the Moth is personal storytelling, and that became quite clear. I said I would really love it if you could say, and if you'd like to find out about other storytelling events, go to storynet.org/calendar. He said, oh no, we couldn't do that. But what we have done is we have mentioned a group in Dublin that used to be a moth group, but then the government regulations were too tough to get through, so they had to split from the moth. I'm going, you have to have government regulations?
Government regulations?
Yeah, I was like, whoa, okay. But we tend to mention them once a year, what they're doing. So if you could send me a story of someone telling a personal story, because that is all they do, we might put it on one of our programs and mention the group that they're associated with.
Oh.
So I'm thinking that the Texas Tejas Storytelling Association is having their 35th annual festival, mm-hmm. and they're having 35 different tellers, and there's got to be one of those
at least story,
suckers, right? And that would be a nice thing to send them to. So I have to pursue that to see if the Moth indeed does have regular shows in Dallas or Fort Worth, because that's the area where the festival is, and see if we can do something to at least get the Moth to.
One of the things we like best about you, Kate, is that you're kind of an evangelist for storytelling, and this is a great example of you pulling on an outreach effort that will produce probably some great connections.
I'm hoping, and the next step is to go to the StoryCorps people who might be more approachable.
Right.
Yeah. I've started giving us like $5 a month to each of them.
Wow. But
I didn't mention that to Catherine Burns.
You're buying your way in. This is very good. Very good.
No, I'm joining their group.
Oh, okay.
By buying myself in, yes.
Well,
so
Actually, I've
What about you? Yeah.
I've been the benefit of some of your evangelism. I told stories up at the Academy for Lifelong Learning in Saratoga, which is a series that you helped start. And I was at Proctor's in a program that we kind of launched, but you've taken the lead on in terms of wordplays. And they were just magical. They were great audiences. They were good stories. And I just want to thank you for providing the seasoning or whatever you do for these kinds of programs. And on Sunday particularly, there was our word plays at Proctor's, and then there was Winter Lights with the interfaith storytelling. And Sandy Schumann, who's been a guest on this show, was one of the tellers at Word Place, and he asked me where he could take a walk and learn something. And so I suggested he walk along the bike path from the Schenectady Community College out past the old locks to Lock 8 on the Erie Canal and come back and look at the fine stonework of that lock that was built in 1855 or something like that, because it's right there off the bike path. And I haven't heard back from him from his soiree, but I did find him a place to go. Yeah, it was, and I'm sure there's a story there at Going Stand.
Right.
I'm just looking for that. So.
And here I jumped to the conclusion that you would have suggested a pub tour.
Sandy doesn't pub.
Sandy doesn't pub. Okay.
Sandy is kind of a vegetarian, non-drinker.
Hops is vegetarian.
He'll take caffeine in, but so
well, it's like so he and I can go for because I don't drink beer. I don't even like the way it smells.
I know. Well,
anyways, we digress.
You can only evangelize so much, I can.
Right. Oh, and I wanted to tell you. In Celebration, I looked at which is our big production at Proctor's every November. I looked at the door prize chits, and several people wrote subscriber. I'm going, subscriber? What does that mean? And then I capital rep subscriber. I went, oh, right. The Proctor's has a Try Me program for their subscribers to either capital rep or to their Broadway series at Proctor's, that they get a free ticket. And Story Circle is one of the free tickets that they can get. So we probably had, that I know of, I'll find out more when I finally get the financial report, but that we had people who tried us out. So that's
more evangelism.
Exactly.
More evangelism.
Exactly. That the talk we had with Jean Leonard, she came up with, oh well, you could be part of our Try Me program.
Yeah.
That would bring us into the Proctor's family.
Well, we are in the Proctor's.
Bring us further in, more tighten our relationship, deepen our relationship.
Well, one of the most genuinely warm and touching moments that I had in storytelling was in my first Monday's open mic. And I reconnected with two of my favorite people. One is a poet by the name of David Walsh, and he's a retired IT, information technology executive with the state. And I once bumped into him and I asked him what the biggest challenge he had. And I thought I was going to hear about computers. And he said, I'd love to have people listen to my poetry. And I said, I think I could fit it. So I had David Walsh and his poetry. And he grew up in Sherburne, New York, in the middle of New York State. And he's got these wonderful stories about Little League Baseball. And they're poems, but they're stories. And his sidekick is one of my most favorite storytellers and people in the world. It was Kent Busman. And he told some stories, so I had the two of them together, and we had just a wonderful, wonderful time. And we had some other tellers, so if you come to open mic, you get to tell if you want to, but they were the feature, and they just wove their magical words and feelings. And you know what's even better than having them on first Monday?
What's better?
Better is having Kent Busman with us as our featured teller. Welcome, Kent Busman.
Thanks. Okay, thanks, Joe.
Well, it's good to have you here, and it was really wonderful to have you earlier in the month over at First Mondays.
Yes, I was there too.
With David, and it's just great to have you. And I must say that I've known Kent almost since he was a child, but but it's been
Wait
a long
second,
time.
Wasn't he an ordained minister by the time you met him?
Actually, he was about to go to divinity school.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
He was, but he had come to work for Camp
When
Fowler.
he was 12. No.
And he then became the director of Camp Fowler, and he was the youth minister at First Reformed.
Mm-hmm.
And you drove back and forth to New Brunswick Seminary to go
4
to
years.
4 years,
Yep.
sleeping in the car. and
Distance
sleeping-
learning, they call it.
Distance learning, now they call it. And,
You learn not to do it anymore.
and in kind of a typical way, when we had his ordination, and his wife Jill and his mother-in-law threw this great party, they wrapped all the silverware up in bandanas, and you got to take your bandana home from Kent's ordination party. That was pretty cool, KP. That was pretty cool.
So I did get a little jar of jam at one wedding, which I thought was much nicer than a drawer freshener or other
Right.
odd things one gets burnt in.
But I remember mine was a red bandana.
Oh, well, that's pretty classic.
Do you still have it?
I probably do. I have, bandanas are very useful. I learned that from you. You can wear them on the trail to keep the sweat off your face.
Right,
can
you have
use
the
them,
picture with the car, and you have it around
That's right.
your head.
We had, when Kent and Harlan Ratmar and I tell the stories as Three Spirits, we did do a promo with us and the bandanas, and Harlan was standing in his car coming out of the roof of his Mini Cooper. That was good.
It's a great story I'll tell you someday about the 101 uses of a bandana.
100 uses
Oh,
of a
does it
bandana?
go?
101.
101.
Does it go with Paul Simon's song, 100 Ways to Lose a Lover? Have you put it?
I think it's 60, but okay, or
what?
30 or 20.
Wait,
or
yeah.
whatever. But maybe it's that much by now, so I'm sure it does.
Kid, bring our viewers up to date on the kind of ways storytelling either found you or you found storytelling, and
How you
what's
use
happened
it.
since then.
Most of my work is directing a camp and retreat center called Camp Fowler up in the south central Adirondacks. It's a place that's for our guests, our campers and our retreaters, it's screen-free. We don't provide any Wi-Fi or any of that stuff when you're there on site to be so that you can really be present, and that takes a little getting used to these days for most people. For
Alexa, she's not here.
yeah, for kids, it's a transformative experience at this point because many have never had that experience of not being wired or wireless or whatever. And what it does is it suddenly forces you to interact this way, eye to eye. Yep, your thumbs get a break. And what we have discovered is that as our kids at camp get older, as they get into senior high, they really look forward to this. It's basically a fast from your electronics. They look forward to making those friendships. A real interesting comment from a young lad last summer who was off to college. He said, "I'm not worried about going to college because Camp Fowler taught me how to make friends." And you do that by being together, by having experiences together, and by learning to share it together. So share who you are, and that's the heart of storytelling. Are those interactions, and storytelling is a integral part of our camp experience. Usually one night a week we have everybody laid out on their blankets and pillows and stuffed animals in the chapel, and we just tell stories of some are personal tales, some are mythic stories, native stories, and we have found it to be a highlight often. Kids, the ADD kids, are suddenly just transfixed because their minds have something to do. A story is always changing, so even if you've heard one before, if it's told well, it's different. And so And that then in turn, I think, gives the kids permission to tell their own stories, to begin to interact in that way. Go ahead.
I mentioned I was going to see you to George Giocas. And Dr. Giocas is the director of palliative care at Ellis Hospital. And you run a Camp Aaron for kids who have lost parents or siblings.
Kids who've lost a loved one.
Yeah.
It's through the community hospice.
And George just sighed and says, "Oh, tell Kent hello, and tell him I'll always remember being in the meadow." Tell us about the meadow.
Actually, it was George who just sent me a clipping from the Times that said 80% of Americans, United States folks, probably will never see the Milky Way.
Whoa.
And if we're made of stardust, we no longer know where we come from. Was the thesis of this article. A third of the people on the planet will never see the Milky Way because they live in such well-lit areas. And we've made some changes where we are. We put in dark sky lighting where we need to have outdoor lighting. And when we are able, we go up to a big field in the middle of the forest to look at stars and to point out constellations, to get the whoa when somebody sees a shooting star, often for the first time, and again, it's just evocative of so many things. Stars come into so many of our stories, and the stars remind us of our appropriate size.
Yeah.
So I remember that. Taking kids up there, all of us, but to know that you are loved and cared for and small is not a bad thing all at once. That there's a bigger story going on, perhaps. That stars lend our thoughts in those directions.
A bigger story going on.
Yeah. I felt that when we were up, my family was up at Bahaba, and we were at a ranger talk at night. They had like a band shell, and he said, "But before we start, I'm going to turn off the lights so we can see the night sky." And I had never seen so many stars in my life. And then they said, "Well, we'll start our program." I'm going, "No, I'm not done. I'm not ready." But that was, let's see, we were dragging our kid around when he was like 10 and 12 or something to national parks, and he's 34 now. So that's not a recent memory.
Are you ready for a story?
You bet, especially from Kent.
Well, we know you're probably
You're called
prepared.
Uncle Kent up at Kent.
I am. Yeah. That's
Uncle Kent, would you tell us a story?
Sure. This is I like mythic tales, and this is one. I did a solstice storytelling event a few weeks ago around the winter solstice, and I like ravens, and so I found this one from I found it. A woman named Misha Maha was the one who wrote what I found, and it's a Norse tale. And today it goes like this. In the beginning, Odin, the All-Fatherer, used to love to walk around the roots of the great tree Yggdrasil, in whose branches the 9 worlds were held. And Odin was curious as for what was going on in the upper worlds and in the world of men, Midgard, and in the worlds beneath them. And every day would wonder at what's happening. And then 2 ravens flew up and perched, one on the left shoulder and one on the right shoulder. And the one on the left shoulder, her eyes were cloudy like the mist on Niflheim, and she was as white as the snow on top of the mountains. And he named this raven Hunan, which means thought. And the raven who perched on his right shoulder, he perched there, and his eyes were clear, clear as the waters in the mountains. And this raven he named Munin, which means memory. And the ravens each morning would call out in their beautiful songs, and they would go out, and they would fly into the 9 worlds, and they would hear what people were saying of the good news and the joy of what was happening all around. And they would come back and they would perch on Odin's shoulders, and Odin would always eagerly listen to what the ravens were telling him. And when they got done, Odin would say, "This is good, but it is not enough. There is more." And each day the ravens would fly away, uncertain about where this more was, and they would come back and again tell Odin about the thoughts of mountains and the murmurings of rivers and all of the wonders of the 9 worlds. And still he would say, "There is more." So one day when the 2 ravens, Hunan and Munin, flew off, and the sun began to get close to setting, and they began to turn to fly back to Odin, Hunan said, "No. We must fly now into the darkness to see, for perhaps there is more there." And Hunan flew off into the thoughts of mankind. And when she flew into the darkness, the thoughts of humans turned from the joy and wonder of the daylight to the ponderings of the darkness. She flew into the thoughts of despair, the thoughts of greed, the dark thoughts of taking what is not theirs, the dark thoughts that humans don't dare think in the daylight. And each of those thoughts coated her feathers as she flew deeper and deeper into the darkness of human thought. Munin, he flew in the other direction. He flew into the direction of memory. The memories that humans put down, never to want to think again in the light, but that snipe at them from the dark and always rise up in the middle of the night. And Munin flew into the ashes and the burnings of the memories of loss, lost loves, lost chances. She flew into the memories of mistakes, the memories of hate, the memories of what could have been. She flew through the memories all the way to the end of time. And in the ashes and fire of the end of time, the smoke curled around her feathers and into her eyes and deep, deep into her throat. And she came back. And Hunan and Munin came back, covered now in darkness, and they flew at the darkest time of night before the dawn comes. They flew on the shoulders of Odin. Their white feathers stained black, their eyes blackened, their throats filled with the ashes so that their sweet sounds were now croaks. And they told Odin of what they had seen. And Odin said, "It is enough. Rest now." And so it is since the beginning, when the All-Father had the ravens on his shoulders. The ravens have been black before us. And they often tell us things we do not wish to remember and give us thoughts we do not wish to have. But should you ever come across a raven who is white, you know that somehow you've been brought back to the beginning, before the thoughts and memories of humans turn dark. And this is why ravens are black.
Oh. That is a story to remember, I must say. And the ravens were thought and memory. Is that their?
Yeah, and thought had the clouded eyes, because you never know what's in the future. You never know what's coming. Then memory has the clear eyes, because you look back and you're. I found that an interesting part of the tale. Makes me want to know more about Nordic tales.
Yeah.
And the 9 worlds, and the world of Midgard, where humans dwell, and the mythologies around. And for me, how certain images just travel from different cultures. The raven obviously is important in North American Native mythology. It shows up in Hebrew scriptures with Elijah and the ravens. It shows up. Ravens
get around. They get around.
Well, they make their presence felt.
Yeah.
Both by their iridescent black feathers and their voices.
Now, Ken, were you looking for this story, or did it find you? That's a different way of phrasing it.
I was looking for a story. This is the one that caught me. I was looking. I like stories that deal. We're Northerners. I really love the changing of the seasons, and I love the growing darkness that comes around with the solstice. And I love celebrating that because we're Northerners. That's a special time for us. We made it to the darkest time, and we're still standing.
Right.
And so I was looking for stories that were evocative of that.
Well, that certainly is evocative. And solstice would be a great time to have a party.
It would be.
Yeah,
Do that next year, Joe.
Yeah.
These clowns, one of them gives an annual party at the solstice.
Yeah. And I have another opportunity, but I'll come back to that another time about the 25th of June.
You know, the original solstice parties started when the kids were really little, and we would play a game in the snow called Raven Freeze the Daylight.
Raven Freeze the Daylight. Off the story.
Tlingit tale of Raven freeing the daylight, and Raven would have to try to catch the sun as they ran around and amazed in the snow. And it wore the children out, and everybody was happy.
I don't remember playing that game. I remember playing a game of soccer in about a foot of snow.
Solstice ball.
Solstice ball.
Yes, I
remember that.
There are no rules in solstice ball.
Right.
Only light versus darkness.
Light versus darkness.
And you hope that light wins.
Yep.
Okay.
And they always did.
Calvin Ball. Calvin and Hobbes. It has no rules. You just cheat until you win.
It was inspired totally by Calvin Ball.
Oh my! We've just sunk to our level.
Calvin is a classic. That he's the only one who sees how alive Hobbes is.
There you go. That's right. Because Hobbes was.
When the parents are there, it's just a stuffed animal, kind of understuffed, but.
I always wanted to have a beer with the guy that wrote that column. I thought that would have been fun, but anyway. Maybe
Gary Fran Yardley knows Gary Trudeau, which I know is not the same guy, but the author of Doonesbury, that you might be able to arrange because he lives up in Saranac.
Yeah.
Oh well, I'll work on that. That would be a.
You could invite some friends if you get that.
I get that. We could do that. Coffee and Saranac Lake with Gary Trudeau. We could do that.
Yeah.
Maybe we ought to just kind of pause with Kent and tell folks about what's coming up with storytelling.
Certainly. First Monday Tales and Stuff comes first on the list. February 3rd, our very own Joe Doolittle will be telling stories that echo off the Mohawk.
And that's close to the anniversary of the Schenectady Massacre. And I like to tell stories about early Schenectady, so that's my feature story is why is Lawrence a statue in our stockade?
And it's sort of emphasizes the aftermath of the massacre as opposed to the details of the actual.
Right, I don't get into the blood and guts.
Right.
Stuff,
yes. Just in case. It's a wonderful story. And this is part of Joe's series for storytelling, music, and spoken word. No tap dancing. Well, it's on a rug. I don't think you would be turned away if you wanted to. Then, the Winter Storyteller Series, sponsored by the Academy for Lifelong Learning up in Saratoga Springs, under the auspices of Empire State College, Joe and I performed there in January. Well, I'm going to be performing this Wednesday, but we tape ahead. But on February 5th, you'll be able to see Kent Busman up there. Stories from the Adirondacks and beyond. And then three other tellers, including Margaret French and Christy Keegan, who have sat in that chair. And so it's free, noon, at the 2 Union Avenue. They have the building right on the edge of Congress Park. There's this octagonal-shaped room. That's where it is. And you'll be welcome. Parking is on the street, so come early and get ready to walk down Union Avenue, or you may have a special place you like to park in Saratoga Springs. Then the Interfaith Story Circle will be having stories of creation from around the world on Thursday, February 6th at the Niskayuna Reformed Church. That's free and open to the public. Come share your stories related to the theme or just come to listen. They have a featured teller, and this was started over 25 years ago by Gert Johnson and others with the idea when people of faith hear each other's stories, they will realize how much they have in common.
And just on the
on
the Interfaith Story Circle, they have a website, and they have at least 10 programs a year. And what's wonderful is that they are hosted in various faith communities. So the first time I was ever in a mosque or a Hindu temple was because of the Interfaith Story Circle. And I commend them and you, if you want a different experience, it's a wonderful way to be introduced to another culture and religion.
So with ourvoice.org/IFSC, Interfaith Story Circle. Then Front Parlor Series, which we have nothing to do with, but they do a moth-like event. It's personal stories. They come up with the topic and publicize it just a few weeks before the event. So they're encouraging people to come up with new personal stories. Though unlike the moth, there is no competition. And it used to be in 2 locations. Now it's dropped back to 1. The second Tuesday of the month, which is February 11th in February. It's now at Little Peck's at 211 Broadway in Troy, 7:30 to 9:30. It's mine. We're married, not to each other. Then Story Circle of the Capital District will have our monthly guild meeting where members share works in progress and can get as much or as little feedback as they want. Please just tell the stories, don't bring anything to read. It will be Wednesday, February 19th, 6 to 8 at the Pine Hills branch of Albany Public Library. Listeners are very welcome. Then we have a lot in February.
A lot of different.
We have word plays at Proctor's. We're in our 13th season there. Solo performers tell stories celebrating the human spirit. And in February, sticky situations. Yes. 2 p.m. in the Hearst Education Center, which is the basement of Proctor's. And the tickets are what you'd pay for a movie. Please come and join us for live entertainment. Then, the 4th Tuesday of every month, except for July and August, up at Cafe Lita is the storytelling open mic. And the featured teller on February 25th is Mary Murphy, who will be appearing here, I think, in April. I think I've lined her up for April.
She's great.
Yes.
Yep.
That the doors open at 6:30, usually a 10-minute limit to the storytelling. Again, no reading, just telling. Modest fee. New tellers always welcome. And of course, Cafe Lena, after she's undergone her facelift, is even more fabulous than it used to be.
Yeah, and actually there's Lena's is up above Hattie's Chicken Shack. And it's right across the street from a great Thai restaurant. So if you wanted to come up
But-
early and have dinner, you could just go.
But I don't think the Thai restaurant is open on Tuesday nights.
I forgot
at
that
the
part.
corner of Phyla and Henry.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, and the new Italian place opposite it is also not open on Tuesday. But there's many other places in Saratoga
I
Springs.
stand corrected.
So just to remind you of our 13th season at Proctor's, 5 word plays and a celebration. That's that slide. Yes, and in March, our season ends with Lemons to Lemonade, which also could be in sticky situations, but especially if you spill your lemonade.
Right,
But
right.
if you want stories and you have a computer, we have over 200 stories on demand. Story Circle at proctors.org. Click on YouTube. And then finally, you can see TV shows on demand. This TV show. Go to Story Circle at proctors.org. Click on Story by Story.
Wow. You could get tired just trying to keep up with all those storytelling.
Yes, I
programs.
find I can't do all of them.
Right. It's amazing. It's
Yes.
amazing. Yeah.
So we have 23 minutes left.
Ooh.
Woo!
23 minutes. We have more than time for one more story, but maybe we ought to get into that story and then we'll talk about stories and we'll talk about this story or that story. Sure. KB.
This is a story I wrote a while ago before I knew about moth, because it's a personal story. And it's the working title is The Woodlot. When I am among the trees, especially the willows and the honey locust, but equally the beeches and the pines and the oaks, I find that I am surrounded by such a sense of gladness that I am almost saved. And daily, Mary Oliver. My brother bought 81 acres back in 1988 from an old dirt farmer named Lincoln Dodd. Lincoln Dodd had this parcel of land in Ottawa County in West Michigan, mostly sandy loam, and he farmed that poor land for corn for about 3 years till the land was even worse than it was before, and the Depression hit. And Lincoln did what so many farmers did during the Depression. He took the trees that the government provided and he planted them in this played out soil to try to hold that soil in place to keep it from blowing into the next county. And they didn't know a whole lot about what they were doing, but they were smart enough to know that you needed to plant a diversity of species. And so Lincoln did that. He planted red pine and Norway spruce and Scotch pine. And my brother bought that place from Lincoln years after he had planted those trees. And I remember going into that woodlot for the very first time. We walked out through the sheep pasture, and Sweep, my brother's border collie, ran out after those sheep, just begging us to call him to command those sheep to come up. And we opened the gate, and Sweep went before us first out into that woodlot. And you walk into the forest where the beech trees were growing. And beech trees don't grow in groves. They grow in herds. And they're massive, big, and that gray bark clings really tight to them. And those old beech trees, if you didn't look up, you could imagine that they were the legs of elephants or ancient dinosaurs that roamed in this place. And your imagination can go wild. And beneath those greater beech trees, you saw the young saplings, 12, 14 feet high, just dancing like young girls in the breeze that came off of the pasture. Behind them, oaks grew up, white oaks and ashes, and it's hard for me to tell sometimes the difference. The barks are so similar. They grew up as you walked up and over the hill that leads down to the gully where Deer Creek meanders down through this old woodlot. taking its time, knowing that once it leaves the gully, it enters the town, and the abuses that will happen to most creeks when they go through a town. So it meanders through this space, and the hemlocks are there on the lee side of the hill, and their tops are bowed over, praying to the great tree from whom all trees come. Though I suspect that some of them are bowing over so they can see their reflection in the stream, for they are a bit vain. The cherries would grow, the woodland cherries were growing in the forest, their bark peeling off, and as you begin to come up, and you see the oaks that come up and they grow, and they open up like big martini glasses, their branches reaching out in praise to the sky, while the voluptuous maples grow, surrounded by their fecundity of little maples growing in those places. And you come up out of the gully and you turn left, north, and that's where Lincoln's trees mostly were. You see these big rows of Norway spruces growing, and I'm allergic to Norway spruces.
I'm allergic.
And they grow dark and dense, and you look deep into the shadows, and if you're there at just the right time, you'll see the fox peering out at you, or perhaps a barred owl perched on one of their branches. And then you go past the Norways into the red pines, and this is the part of the forest where the campsite was, where my brother would come out with his kids and his friend and her kids, and they would camp there and have the campfire and eat s'mores and campfire food, and they'd sleep out in the tents in the grove at night and see those stars in the sky, or hear those barred owls calling. And I'm sure the memory of the campsite far exceeds the actual experience of being there, because that's how memories work. And you walk through this woodlands, and you can't help but be surrounded by such a sense of gladness. And my brother would spend his days out there after work, going through his forest. And now the woodland grove is down. Great trees fallen that had unearthly power to please the earthly sight, and gave unearthly solace to those whose minds grew quiet there. To live to mourn the loss of an ancient woodland, loved always with a love handed down, that is a grief that will outlive the griever. Wendell Berry. August 22nd, 1998. A windstorm blew through Ottawa County. Wind speeds up to 120 miles an hour had never been recorded in this area, and yet it swept through woodlots like my brother's. And in a matter of minutes, it was gone. My brother walked through the sheep gate that had blown open and shut it tight so the sheep couldn't escape, and saw the great beeches that had met him snapped off, 12, 15 feet high, fallen among the young ones that no longer danced at their feet. The great cherry that held the tree fort on its mighty limb, the limb broken down and the tree fort scattered on the ground. The oaks which tried to withstand the wind were broken and beaten, also losing many of their branches. As you walked through the detritus and the debris and the branches and the fallen logs, you walked the trail down toward the bridge over Deer Creek, and you turned and you saw the hemlocks, who were protected by the hill. Their heads still drooped over, and you could almost sense them weeping the loss of their kin. You walk up, and it was Lincoln's trees, those 80-foot tall Norway spruces and red pines that took it the worst. The wind had whipped them and spun them around, and they fell just the way they lived, dying in each other's arms as they fell to the forest floor. My brother cried, as you do when you see the loss of such greatness and such wonder. And then he did the one thing you do. He took his chainsaw and he began to cut the trees up, and he cut wood for firewood, and when he had cut enough, he cut some more. And he began to pull the branches from the forest floor, and he made big piles of the branches throughout the woodlot. And when the winter snows had come, he lit them on fire and burned them like funeral pyres. The remaining trees, caught by the heat, going up and down, remembering their lost loved ones with whom they had shared existence. The space in the forest where the campsite was now completely exposed and no longer filled with whimsum and wonder. And then it happened almost with Job-like precision. As if the windstorm wasn't enough, it had weakened the trees, and the red-headed pine sawfly came in and crawled under the bark of the red pines and ate the needles, so that the trees that were remaining began to die. And my father called the local forester to come in and harvest what was there, and they didn't care for the trees or the woodlot and knew that it would be a slim harvest that they'd pull out. And their big machinery came in after 2 or 3 weeks of rain and rutted the land that my brother had so tended, even as Lincoln had so tended it, and took the remaining trees out. Then the beeches got the blight, and their tight bark are the ones that were left, and the little ones all blistered out, and they too began to die. And the forest, as we knew it, was no more. Slowly they returned to the woodland left alone. Great trees, outspreading and upright, apostles of the living light. Wendell-Berry. I last visited my brother's woodlot in winter of 2011. The snow was deep, so I put on my snowshoes and I walked out through the neglected sheep fence. My brother had stopped tending sheep after Sweep had gotten old and died. The joy was somehow diminished in keeping the sheep. He thought about selling the land and moving. He was retiring. So I walked one last time through the woodlot. Walking through the remnants of the gate, I saw a 12-foot tall beech sentinel, still broken off at the top, still standing guard, as if that was her duty to remain. The detritus on the floor had been picked up and had 13 years to go back into that sandy loam, and so the forest was relatively clear as I crunched over the snow through the woodlot. And then something caught my eye. It was sort of a flesh-colored tube that stood up, and I walked over to it, and I looked down this 3-foot tall tube, and there was a tree inside of it. It was an oak, or perhaps an ash. I sometimes get them mixed up. And then as my eyes adjusted, I saw 2 more, and then 2 more, and I looked around. There must have been 50 of these flesh-colored tubes in this particular part of the forest. I walked down the hill over what was left of the bridge over Deer Creek, still meandering its way as though nothing had happened, and in its sense, nothing had happened. And I walked up to where the maples and the oaks were, and I saw that the forest had been cleared around, and the ones that were too broken had been taken out to give light to those who were still healthy, and they looked healthy. They looked well. And I turned the corner to where the great trees had been, the Norways and the red pines, and it was all filled with thickets and briars and brambles. I was pondering the old forest, and then under the 2 feet of snow, I saw it, sticking up just a bit. It was the top of a Norway spruce. And then another, and then a red pine. And then another, and then I saw a white pine over there. And then birches growing. And I walked and I counted 50 trees, 100 trees. I stopped after 200. There were too many trees to count. And as I walked around, I began to smile a little, thinking that in 5 years, those trees would be almost as tall as me. And in 10 years, it would start to look like a forest again. And that perhaps someday, there'd be a campsite out here again, filled with barred owls and campfires and wonder. I got back and I asked my brother about the trees. How many did you plant? I said. He paused for a minute. He thought. About 10,000, he estimated. 10,000 trees. He said the land was too poor. It couldn't do it on its own. Maybe in 100 years, if it's still here, it could do it on its own. But not now. And knowing that those trees are there, I find that I am almost saved. And daily. The Woodlot, in honor of my brother Paul Bushman.
Oh, KB.
And the majesty of trees.
There are some great creatures.
Yes. Longer lived, or tribes of their own.
You folded so much back onto itself in that story by the way you've told it. The hemlocks sweep, the metaphor of the gate taking you places and then being worn down.
Think about that one.
Pardon?
I didn't think about that one. Yeah.
No, I'm just.
Good
No,
one.
I was just,
about
and the continuity of the meander in the stream. I mean, there are a number of very strong metaphors already in the metaphor of the Woodlot. So, I was just quite taken by that. Now is your brother Paul still living on this property?
No, they moved.
They moved.
He still owns a good chunk of that woodlot and goes back. He calls it the Dodd pasture.
The Dodd
where the
pasture.
sheep were and the old barn was at that one point. And so he goes in through there and still owns a good chunk of that woodlot and sees those trees on occasion. A bunch of them have been lost again when the power company came through and put in power lines and just mowed down trees indiscriminately, never knowing that they'd been hand planted and hand watered. I mean, it's not just planting the trees, but he would go out in the summer and water them, weekly to keep
them going,
to keep some of them alive. I mean, obviously, not all 10,000 survived the designs of Providence, but. It's an important spot because important things are done there. It's important for trees to grow. It's important to my brother. We often mark our lives by certain things, and he can mark his by trees.
And that part of Michigan has a draw for the Bushman family.
That's where we hail from.
Yeah. Now, tell us a little bit of the story of who's taking over your brother's veterinary practice.
Another brother.
So my brother is a large animal vet.
Paul or a different one?
Paul. Okay. Large animal, vet. Not a large, animal vet.
Right.
Very important.
Very important thing.
Well, but he is rather tall.
He's
Yeah.
So my son Noah is in the last 3 months of vet school, and he also will become a large animal, vet, and literally will take over my brother's spot in a 6 or 7 person practice, and will become Dr. Bushman. They can just, they don't have to change the name plaque. They don't have to change
Right.
what's on the
Gee, you're looking
on
really
the coveralls.
good.
Yeah, boy, you've lost a little weight.
Broadened out a bit. Yeah.
Facelift.
Yeah. So
I think that's a good story in and of itself, and I have some Noah Bushman
the
stories.
real story about that is that how do you go? The story of going from a theater major to a large animal vet is probably the real good story, because and he wouldn't be the one without the other.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's for another
Computer
telly.
science, master's degree, storyteller. Yeah.
Not an obvious fit.
No. Anyway, I appreciate you sharing that, because I think it's just a nice part of the family link.
Yes. You could probably find that woodlot on Google Maps. You
Oh,
could,
I didn't think
you
about
could,
that.
they don't visit often, but you could get an updated view.
Well, that's
without
an interesting
being-
thought.
Yeah.
That's tempting, though it's sort of like kids at camp. You kind of being there is so different
right.
than seeing it. It's
But it's sort of a
seeing
snapshot.
and smelling and
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. And you wouldn't have the right perspective to see how big the martini glasses are.
yeah.
And,
But still, no.
but if you wanted to get a raven's eye view,
Very
yeah,
good,
that's
very
good,
good.
yeah.
A
Still
raven's
birch in
eye
those
view.
trees.
yeah.
You could use thought and memory in that conflict, that construct.
When you spoke of the memory of that disaster will live beyond our lifetime.
The grief that outlives the griever, according to Wendell Berry.
Yes. Are you familiar with the Washington County Fairgrounds, Schaghticoke? Did you know that it used to be an apple orchard?
No.
Joe Peck tells in the story, in one of his stories, it's a sideline, but that it was an apple orchard. And one time during the January thaw, the thaw was so warm that the sap came up, and then there was a hard freeze, and the trees exploded.
Ooh.
And that's why there's this big open area, because it's the grave site of this apple orchard.
Wow.
So,
Well, the other thing that echoes a bit in the story, Ken, is your use of Mary Oliver and Wendell Berry, who are two of my favorite poems. And in terms of the voice that you have, that the story has, when you first start, it's your voice. And then when you remind us that it's Wendell Berry, that also is another reinforcing loop for those of us who know Wendell Berry's work, being the farmer and the Sabbath rest and those kinds of things. So that's a nice weave in the whole element. And for those of you who are interested in how to create stories, you just heard a wonderful use of an outside force in a personal story to provide a real reference on meaning. I was really, you were an artist. I just got to say, you were just an artist.
and unfortunately, we have to say goodbye.
Oh.
We have to say goodbye now. Thank you, Kent.
Thank you,
you for
Kent.
coming.
Thank you for listening and watching. We'll see you next month. Much good cheer.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons